moto ona bango.
And welcome from the Sackers Trust to the fourth in the series of election-related webinars. This is the fourth, and it runs in parallel with the usual Sackers dialogue. We do that to ensure that related to the economy. Those of you who are following will have noticed that we have adopted a framework here. We pose the notion of ways to think of the electoral process of the economy was to look at 4 or 5 bases. So information, tonight, we're going to be focusing on so second conclusion. We've been doing these with certain in order of the 2020 election, aiming by the change, comprehensive picture, and readiness to meet the those of you following the message of what we have done to them to contrast clear Zimbabwe elections, adequacy of those elections has been the the reason to do this is elections that take place are not mandated by the results of polling, but a process which every step is technically accounts towards the final result. I mean, in the after getting material just energy, it's very important to about the very critical difference. We pointed out that one of the important things about that decision was that the court looked at the longer way down to back number of the commissioners. They were able to deal with what which commissioners had succeeded through every single second election from the beginning to the result. So they were a state parliament. Well, had succeeded. So the point there is the entire process. That's what the pre-audit is all about. Now, if you do a pre-audit very carefully, it's possible to determine whether before the poll, the conditions are present that will allow the kind of irreversibility that leads in elections. Now, in some countries, irreversibility happens in a very simple way. The counting starts to come in and one candidate or one party takes one look at the results and says, we clearly are beaten, and they concede. In other countries, they go all the way through the poll, and sometimes the poll itself is contested. In fact, William Matunga pointed out that it's almost inevitable that in Africa, at any rate, that there will be contests for the very simple reason, as he put it, and that is that if you don't challenge, you stand the risk of losing your own political support. So that's exactly why we are looking at this. We're hoping that we will see by the end of this webinar series, we have about another 6 to go, we will be in the position to say the conditions are adequate or not. So tonight, as I said, we're looking at pillar 2, inclusion. Now, what inclusion means is that people are able to participate in the election. And that means that are the systems sufficient to meet the constitutional requirement in our constitution that all citizens may vote and that it must be easy for them to vote. Now, this is what we're looking at today. And a key aspect of that is to make sure that no games like gerrymandering, disqualification takes place that prevents people from voting or loads the vote in a particular way. So as we said, the topic tonight is delimitation and the voters' role, regional best practice and the reality in Zimbabwe. Some of you who look at international affairs will notice that there's considerable discussion going on in the United States about firstly redrawing boundaries so that people are included in one group or another, and also conditions about who can access the vote. Can you just pitch up with an ID, or do you have to have a driving license? These are all factors that lead to people being included or excluded. And the point about our constitution, at any rate, is that the process should be as inclusive as possible, that every citizen should be able to register, and every citizen should be able to vote, and every vote should count. And part of that is the enormous problem of delimitation, and that is that all constituencies are balanced, meaning that you have not drawn the line such that it favors one party or another. So we're very lucky tonight because we have a very eminent panel, and the keynote will be given by Staffan Dano, who's the Senior Global Electoral Operations and Administration Advisor at IFES. Staffan is extremely experienced in elections. 30 years in 40 countries has given him a view of all the things that happen. And within IFES and the IFES team, they have multiple publications on electoral integrity, the kinds of things that need to be in place to meet the conditions for an acceptable election. And one of those is delimitation. Staffan, additionally, apart from his international experience, is completely suited to talk about delimitation because he's got very strong experience in Zimbabwe, both as a political scientist. He's co-authored a book on the political economy, 20 years of independence in Zimbabwe, from liberation to authoritarianism. And he's been here as observer and expert, and he's contributed widely to multiple reports and monographs on election. And most recently, a very important publication on electoral integrity that IFES has put together. So his expertise will be very important tonight. And he'll be joined by two of our local experts, Ian Gorodema from Zessen and Solomon Bobusibunu from ERC, both who've been panelists on recent discussions, are watching this election with a keen eye, have watched previous elections, have observed elections in other countries, and so they have a very good and experienced view of what's going on. So they'll provide the local contrast to Staffan, who concentrates mainly on delimitation, but we hope that Ian and Solomon will not just limit themselves to delimitation, but they will also be talking a little bit about the existing conditions and problems with the voters' law. So with no further ado, I would like to hand over and welcome Stefan Danov and hand it over to you. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you to SAPES for inviting me to talk today.
Stefan, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
You're muted, Stefan.
I'm still muted.
David, he's muted.
No, you're muted now.
No, we can.
But we could
We're
hear.
not hearing you, Stefan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you now.
Okay, excellent. Let me just share my screen as well.
Just give me a second. Just give me a
Yep.
second.
Stefan, can you hear me? You're muted. We can't hear you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Just give me a second.
Okay.
Sure.
Just now.
No problem at all. Ah, yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. You can share your screen now.
Yep, you can see my screen, or?
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Oh, excellent. So thank you very much, and it's great to see that you've taken on board to look at delimitation, because it's actually a fairly, I wouldn't call it understudied, but I think it's a part of the electoral process that is sometimes overlooked and ignored in the discussion when it comes to free and fair elections. And there are basically three things I will be talking to you about today. A bit about the what do we mean by delimitation? What are the sort of the principles when we're looking and evaluating a delimitation exercise, and then add some examples from the US, which Tony mentioned is a hotbed when it comes to good examples, but also terrible examples when it comes to delimitation, and then also a few from the African continent as well. And on the tail end, I will sort of look at the 5 principles that is governing delimitation, and see where things stand in Zimbabwe. And I would definitely put a qualifier there, is that this is something that I did fairly quickly. I haven't been following Zimbabwe very closely for the last couple of years, so take that with a pinch of salt. It's more to stimulate a bit of a discussion and dialogue after my presentation, and after my esteemed colleagues have also spoken on for this panel. So let me begin by talking a bit about delimitation, what we mean by that. And it is, as Tony mentioned, in the simplest form, it is how do we delineate the electoral constituencies that will be used on election day. And in some places, this is of great interest to parties, media, commentators, civil society, as they realize it directly impacts elections and their ability to vote. In other places, delimitation is a non-issue, and that could be partially because it's done professionally, it's done by a politically neutral entity using well-defined and accepted criteria. So therefore, it's a process that's being handled without much controversy. In other places, delimitation is overlooked because people are simply not aware of what it is, or that it's actually being undertaken, and then we're having a problem. Because just because we're not looking at it or not scrutinizing it doesn't mean that it's a healthy sign. It could be the opposite. So if we're looking here, is an example from Texas. Here we can see that the way the lines are drawn can have very specific consequences. In this case here in Texas, if we're looking at the boundary, are the white ones. The text one here is the white ones, where they clearly manipulated and draw the lines to make sure that their party sympathizers were included in the redistricting exercise taking place here. And it's obvious that the boundary commission in this case was severely controlled by one political party. Another example, and I call it the Obama example. And this is a case where we see new lines were redrawn to leave an incumbent house out of the district that the person used to be a representative of, because in most places you have to reside in the constituency that you're going to represent. So if your residency is suddenly being excluded from the new district, then by default or by de jure, you're not allowed to run for office. And this is precisely what happened to later to be President Obama when he was running at the Congress in 2002 in Chicago. He came in late in the primaries, and he already then proved to be an eminent campaigner and secured over 30% of the vote. So his opponent within the party made sure that when they withdrew the boundaries, they made sure to exclude the residency of Barack Obama, and therefore he was prevented from running in that constituency, and an incumbent therefore won the seat and could retain it. Another way that they can use changes to delimitation to knock out some of your competitors, it would be to actually change it in such a way that suddenly you have two eminent candidates residing within the same district, and therefore you could at least get rid of one by that way, doing it that way, because there's only one candidate that can run for the office. Looking at delimitation, it is not only who is doing delimitation and how we are redrawing the boundaries. We also need to be aware of when do we conduct delimitation. And a number of places, there could be some drastic movements of population. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be a natural people moving to the cities in a rapid form because of work, because of studies, or it could be because of climate change. We're having flooding, we're having dry spells, and these things that will and result in people moving about quite a bit. Or it could be for political violence or something like that, that suddenly they need to leave one area for another. So those are some of the reasons why we might have drastic changes of people moving on a short notice. The thing is, though, when we're looking at when redistricting is taking place in general, it's usually once per decade. And it's normally that is taking place after census been conducted. So those are some of the examples that we see out there, how people can use and misuse the delimitation exercise in order to benefit from it. So what are then sort of the 5 foundational principles when we're looking at reviewing a delimitation process? I'll just quickly run through the 5 ones and then dig in slightly deeper in each of them over the next 10 minutes or so. Impartiality. Of course, that is a huge one here. And you can recognize the 3 criteria from when we're looking at reviewing an election authority. We're looking at a non-partisan, independent, and professional body. Those are sort of the 3 criteria when we're judging who's responsible for undertaking the delimitation exercise. Equality, I think that's the one we are probably most familiar with when we're looking at and reviewing a delimitation exercise. Is so, you know, what's the weight of my vote, meaning how many people are registered, or if it's a census, are allocated to a constituency and therefore we can see what's the weight per vote in that constituency. I have an example down the road, and we want to make sure that is as equal as possible. So it is the same amount of votes that's needed in order to elect your representative. There's some emerging recommendations when it comes to what that deviation should be between, you know, above the national quota and below the national quota. I will also mention, you know, the situation is in Kenya, whether that's a good or bad one, but this is an important one. But I will also flag something here. It's important to think about when we look at the quota, whether it is the total spread we're talking about, or if there's something else when we're talking about that percentage deviation about it. It might sound a bit technical, but I'll show an example later on and hopefully become clear. But that's an immensely important thing to look at when you're looking at your law, what it says. Representativeness. Of course, we want the constituencies to be drawn, taking in account so we have a cohesive community, not like the one we saw at one of the examples that I showed before, which was spread out and looked horrific, and how they had used that to manipulate it in their favor. And then you take into consideration the administrative boundaries, geographical features, and communities of interest. And these features could be mountains, rivers, roads, bridges, and so on. When we're also doing these kind of limitations, we need to look at non-discrimination. We want to make sure that the boundaries are not used to manipulate against voters on account of race, color, language, religion, and such issues. And finally, transparency. And again, I think this is something you will find very similar to the lens we were putting on the election authority when they're doing, for instance, the voter registration. Has this been a transparent and accessible public exercise that they're going about doing here? So it's not something that's being done behind closed doors and without much scrutiny and insight from stakeholders, be that media, be that parties, be that civil society, and alike. So the first foundation principle is impartiality. I mean, it might sound like a given. People with political interest shouldn't really be responsible for something as politically sensitive as delimitation. But that's not always the case, unfortunately. As I will show later on, there's a number of cases where the boundary delimitation has been led by legislature, and they are certainly not neutral bodies. They're certainly construed in a way that fits their agenda. But the main principles when it comes to impartiality, is that it should be an independent, as I said, independent and neutral body. But also one area that I've noticed where there is certainly a lot of things lacking, and that's that they're supposed to be professional. They're supposed to be knowing what they're doing when it comes to this thing. And if we don't have independent professional entities doing this, of course, the credibility of the delimitation process will suffer, and the legitimacy of the election outcome might also be in doubt. The trends when it comes to the impartiality variable is that increasingly we have more and more independent boundary commissions being used, maybe not in the US, but elsewhere, or it becomes part of an EMB mandate. And that works as long as the EMB is perceived, at least, to be independent, because then they're fulfilling that criteria of being an independent entity. The problem they might be facing if the mandate rests within EMB is that they might only do delimitation once every 10 years, and sometimes even more rarer than that. And then they lose the expertise, they lose the knowledge of how this is being done. And in order to compensate for this loss of know-how, the reach into other state agencies that might be very close to the executive. And then you might have some questions regarding the independence of that support that's given by a third agency to the election authority undertaking the delimitation exercise. They might be technically very competent. They might have the latest equipment and these things, but if we cannot trust their independence in conducting this, there might be a problem. We also see that in entities that are doing boundary delimitations, that they have a unique skill set and a broad skill set. I mentioned just a few of the skill sets we normally see, you know, when it comes to geography, cartography, demography, GIS, statistics, and the like. I will show you a Kenya example and give you a bit of insight of what the Kenyans are doing when it comes to professionalism and their know-how they're looking for when it comes to organizing delimitation. And then finally, politicians are rarely part of a commission on decision-making process. So just quickly see what Kenya are looking at when they're doing a delimitation and exercise. I was talking to a former chairperson of the IBC about these things, who gave me some good insights. You can see here, there's a whole host of technical experts that are involved when it comes to the delimitation exercise. As I mentioned before, cartographers, demographers, sociologists, lawyers, historians, urban planners, surveyors, and these things, all to make sure that you're using the best possible data about the geographical locations but also how you are looking at the cohesiveness of the entities and the local communities that's going to be impacted by this, to making sure that you're not dividing them up based on ignorance when it comes to local conditions on the ground. And you see the data source here is not just the census. The census is but one of these major data sources that are being used for doing delimitation. You know, having information from the Forestry Service, the Wildlife Service, Water Resource Management, and Kenya Roads authorities as well. So I think that's important, that we shouldn't just look at the census that are being used for delimitation. We also need to look at what are the other complementary databases that are being used in order to make these kind of decisions. So I think this equality of voting strength is one of the most well-known of the principles for delimitation. The underpinning principle here is that each vote should have the same value. So it's the one person, one vote. And if we are straying too much from that national sort of quota that we're having, where we're usually dividing, in a number of places, you're dividing the number of people living in the country with the number of constituencies that's going to be electing officials. You get a figure, and then you tend to have a deviation from that one, because it cannot be a perfect, can't be a one-to-one match. So in some places there might be 5 different difference, in some places it might 10, in some places it might be even higher. And I'm not sure if that is still the case. I need to double check that. But as far as I understand, in Kenya, the deviation that's allowed is actually up to 40% in cities and more sparsely populated areas. And that's a huge deviation from the quota that's supposed to be securing a one person, one vote value. And when we're looking at the trends here, we can see that census is still by far the most common base, followed by voters' roll. And the interval is, as I said earlier, it's often within 10 years, a census must be taken, and then you undertake the delimitation exercise following that one. What we have noticed, though, is in places where we don't have a census taking place followed by delimitation every 10 years, we have something called the passive malapportionment, and that is people continue to move maybe to the cities and increasingly speed. And as we are failing to undertake the delimitation exercise, we're having a passive malapportionment where suddenly for every additional person that's leaving the rural area for the urban constituency, the value of the vote is being undermined in the cities, while the remaining ones in the urban areas, sorry, in the rural areas are increasing in value. And then we also have, of course, the blatant one when we're having gerrymandering, where political party are using and abusing the system in their favor. So I mentioned earlier that I will show you the importance when it comes to just a general deviation or a total deviation from the national quota when it comes to this equal value. In this example, we're having, say there are 10,000 people living in this fictitious example, and we're having 10 seats that are going to be elected. So that gives us a ideal population of 1,000 people. That is sort of the quota that we're looking at here. So, and we're having, as I said, 10 constituencies here. If we're looking at district number 4, we can see that it's 940 people living there. So they are 6% below the average. We're looking at district number 9, which have a 1,050 population. That means there are 5% plus deviation. So if we're looking at the total deviation here, it will mean we're looking at 11% as a spread. So the question we need to ask ourselves when we're looking at the cases like Zimbabwe, where I think you still have 20% deviation, is that total deviation, or is it just a deviation from the national quota? Because if it is the total deviation, that means that the spread we can have from the national quota is either plus 10% or minus 10% deviation from that national quota. If it's just a non-defined as a total deviation, suddenly this 20% means you can be either plus 20% or minus 20%. And that gives a total deviation of 40% instead. And that's a huge, huge difference. So I'm not sure if there's been any court cases or anything like that, but you can certainly educate me on that when it comes to how that is being interpreted in Zimbabwe. But it's something worth looking into for sure. So looking at the principles on representativeness. I think the key here is looking at communities. It's relatively easy for the entities doing a boundary delimitation to figure out what are the administrative boundaries. Also, what are the geographical features? Is there a river? Is there a mountain range or something like that to draw the lines? But when it comes to community interest, that is very unspecified. And if it's not really defined in the electoral laws, then we don't really tend to see that the boundary authority are doing much more to specify it. And if we don't have this, that gives them a lot of latitude to play around with. So I think it's important to look at what are the criteria, true criteria being used and specified by the boundary authority when they're looking at these kind, especially when it comes to the principle of representativeness. Let's then move on to the non-discrimination. I think this one, because of the electoral system we're having in Zimbabwe, is very, very difficult to adhere to. Because de facto what you have, it's only one seat they're going to be elected in each constituency. And then it is very difficult to be accommodating minorities, because in general they will be disadvantaged. So this is a tricky one adhere to in any place they got a first past the post electoral system. What one tend to do, and which I understand is also been done in Zimbabwe, at least for the first transition election, was that you had special provisions to guarantee some minority representation in the parliament. It might be for women, it might be for people with disabilities. I remember you used to have two PWD senators a few elections back. I'm not sure if that's been retained or not in Zimbabwe. And this is just one of those examples when it comes to what can happen if you don't following this compactness of trying to keep the community together in a delimitation exercise. If you want to have the densest of the most compact version of it, you see that in the left circle. But then where people been operating where the criteria has been less well defined, suddenly you can find yourself that you're having a delimitation exercise that's looking like the picture on the right. And since that was so ill-defined in the law, that was deemed to be legit, even though they were taken to court. So the fifth and final principle has to do with transparency. And I think this is, once again, something that you can almost apply similar approach as you had when it comes to scrutinizing a voter registration exercise. When it talks about transparency, it's not just a matter of if the process by which they undertook the delimitation exercise was open and accessible to voters and observers, but also were you able to have a look at the data itself? Because it's extremely difficult to, after the fact, to determine how come they decided to put the line in a certain place if you don't have access to the data, access to the software that were used for the delimitation exercise. So the risk is, of course, that insufficient transparency undermines the public confidence in the integrity of the delimitation process. And I have sort of 4 points there when it comes to the note when it comes to transparency. You need to have a public awareness program designed to educate the stakeholders about the process. Yeah, that's absolutely essential. But it's not just to take them through in general, like a civic education class and explain why you do delimitation, what's good about it, and its role in the democratic and electoral process. You also, at least when it comes to certain target audience, be the political parties, be the civil society, observers, the media, you need to explain to them what's the delimitation method, what are the criteria used to draw the boundaries, and make them public, and explain in advance before you commencing the drawing phase. They should also be consulted during the process and solicit the input. So you need to, just like we did with the voter registration exercise, you give and present a public draft. This is version 1, and then you seek input, and then you consider the input, and then you make a decision, but you justify the decision as well. So it's important, that's justification. So here is the Kenya model. It's not the one they used the very latest, but I think it's better to look one earlier. It's about 10 years ago they used this one in Kenya, because the method they went about and the level of technology that we used at that time is about similar to what is being utilized right now in Zimbabwe. So these are sort of the 15, 16 steps that I think is essential, that should be an integral part of any delimitation plan. And I'm not sure if SEC has developed and released its plan, so you can go through it and see that all these components are part of it and how they intend to deliver on its mandate. But it's development of a strategy and a work plan to deliver the delimitation. That's sort of the big one. You need to have your ops plan, how this is going to look like. Then you need to start focusing on training commissioners and the management on what are the principles, how this is going to go about. You of course need to train the staff. They're going to be doing the delimitation, absolutely essential. You need to determine of governance structure to deliver boundary mandate and the second review, how that's going to look like. How's that review process going to look like? Who's going to be invited? Who has the right to file complaint? And how do we undertake this hearing? How do we make decisions? And how do we release those and justify the decision? The analysis, the modeling, and the determination of the modern methodology and formula for delimitation needs to be clear and needs to be made public. You need to design the procedures, processes, and decision-making structures for delimitation. Then, of course, thereafter follows the voter education campaign and public hearing approach. You launch the voter education campaign. You make sure you have the GIS laboratory and the equipment you need in order to draw these maps electronically. You make sure you're having the experts on board. Then you actually do the collecting of the data. You do the analysis on these several different databases you have at your disposal. You make them public on the first review. Boundaries thereafter are harmonized based on the input you have from the public when it comes to the first review of the lines on the map. And then you prepare your second review, and then you need to be ready for the legal petitions, and thereafter internally within the boundary authority they do an evaluation. So I think this is a good model. It's a good process that fits with the legal framework in Kenya. And I think with some minor tweaks, this is sort of the normal steps that we would be looking at when we review the level of preparations and the way that the election authority is planning to go about fulfilling its delimitation mandate. I'm not going to go through these ones, but I know we're going to be sharing this PowerPoint. These are just some of the standards and some of the best practices that we have easily available. Each of these 5 principles. What I want to go to now is sort of the final 5 minutes where we talk about these 5 principles from a Zimbabwe perspective. Look at principle number 1 when it comes to independent, impartial, and professional delimitation authority. I think the independence/impartiality perception probably in doubt, because the perception of SEC might not be ideal when it comes to this. If we're also looking at the boundary related expertise within SEC, I think from my perspective, and again, as I said, the qualifier early on, I haven't been following it closely at all. So I could be way off here. So I'm more than interested to hear your take on this and learn from you. Is that it's unknown, since I haven't done a delimitation exercise in a very, very long time. Yes, I know that SEC has probably retained quite a number of its staff that's been with them for 15 and 20 years, but the way we go about doing delimitation exercises these days are way, way, way different to the way we did it 15 and 20 years ago. And I would imagine there has been some updates when it comes to the level of technology used in Zimbabwe when it comes to cartography, map making, and so on. Therefore, we don't know, since we don't know what the expertise is within SEC when it comes to delimitation, they're probably going to have to rely on other state agencies, but we don't really know what type of expertise are we looking at, who are these individuals, and from which entities are they being seconded to help them with it. That's an unknown. We also noticed that the delimitation is completed 6 months before E-Day. On the one hand, that's good because it's going to be fresh and late information. So it's going to be sort of the most recent one if they've been updating the voter register in a good way. But it also makes it very short time for people to actually learn the new boundary delimitations and actually start abiding by them. When it comes to the equality of one person, one vote, we're having that 20% deviation. We don't know, is that sort of in the total deviation, or is it the different way that we judge whether it's plus minus 20%, or if it's de facto 10% or plus or 10% minus on the deviation percentage. I think from a theoretical perspective, at least, using the voter register in sense of the census makes it more relevant. When we're using a census for this delineation, we might have a couple of problems. We might have not just people in voting age, but might also include everyone that's living, or actually not living, that is present in that constituency on that day. So they might be there on that day, but might not be their residency from an electoral perspective. On the other hand, if we're using the voter register as the base for delimitation, then it's only going to be people of voting age, and they're going to be in their, in most of the times at least, in their residency where they're going to be voting from. And also doing since there's a continuous voter registration exercise in Zimbabwe, at least in theory, then it should be faster and cheaper to do it that way, rather than have to rely on a census that's only taking place 10 years and take much longer to complete the census before they have the data and use it on. Looking at representativeness under principle number 3, it's less clear how geographical features and communities of interest are considered and integrated here. It's a matter of SEC being as specific and detailed as possible to tell you what are the criteria being used and how are they measuring these criteria for representativeness. Principle number 4, the non-discrimination. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a challenge in Zimbabwe to live up to this principle because of the first past the post, with only one vote or one seat in each constituency, and then almost by default you will have that a lot of the minorities, almost irrespective of how you draw the constituency, except in extreme circumstances, that they will be at a disadvantage, and that's why we're having these set aside seats are so important to compensate for these things. The transparency aspect. You know, that we want the process to be transparent and accessible to the public. The question here, do we have a delimitation operational plan that been shared by SEC? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. If they're using GIS software, has that been reviewed by the public? Do we know what it is? What types of delimitation data is being collected and used? Are they solely doing the census, or are they also, like we saw in the case of Kenya, doing 5, 6 other databases? If so, which ones are they? If there are conflicting information and data from these databases, which one is taking the lead over the other? We're trying to ascertain here, based on what criteria are they making sensitive decisions when it comes to how we draw the lines when it comes to these constituencies. Also, we don't know if these draft delimitation, in the Kenyan case, they call it sort of the version 1, if that is shared with the affected communities for input via public hearings. I've noticed that SEC is out doing voter education campaigns or information activities in the ground, but will they actually also hear them out when it comes to their concerns, when it comes to the actual drafting of the new lines or not? And not just sharing them with the local communities, but also unclear at this stage if draft delimitation maps will be shared with external stakeholders for input, such as parties, CSOs, and inclusion-related organizations. And I stop there. So thank you very much for listening to my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Staffan. That was detailed and extremely interesting, especially from the point of view going into the selection and doing some kind of pre-audit. Just a quick question to you. In the range of technical issues that are necessary for an election, how fundamental is delimitation? You provided us with an excellent checklist of the kinds of things that you could see in Kenya. And then you raised a whole series of concerns about Zimbabwe. And before asking Ian to come in, I'm interested in your general view about how fundamental it is to the integrity of an election.
No, I think it's immensely important, especially when it comes to the value of the vote. I mean, I think that's the one most obvious one. You know, if we do having potentially 40% difference, and if we haven't, then that's what what the law is telling us, 40%. I mean, I think that's way too generous. But then if we haven't undertaking a proper redelimitation, maybe for another 10 years before that, then suddenly that sort of the passive maladministration or malapportionment is certainly accentuating this one and undermining the most fundamental part of one vote, one person. So I think that is immensely important. And I think one of the reasons why international observers are paying less focus on that is because they simply arrived too late for it, you know, so they haven't really seen it, and therefore they don't want to include it in their analysis. And that's why I think a lot of attention is not enough attention is paid to this issue.
So then you get a sort of overweening focus on the voter's role as opposed to delimitation.
Correct.
Right. And as you'll be aware, in the past, we've had considerable confusion and dislike of what we found when we've analyzed the voters' role in 2008 and 2013. I don't think a comprehensive one was done in 2018, but we've already had some preliminary looks at the voters' role that suggested many kinds of problems. But the question that you're raising, that I think is fundamental, is that, and it hinges on this transparency question, is that you have a body that has a strategy, that has the expertise, that you can check and watch every single step all the way down to the end when the constituencies are finally agreed. That seems a fundamental checklist that should be included in any audit of the voters' role.
No, I concur very much so.
Okay, thank you, Staffan. We'll come back to you for a bit.
Thank you.
Sorry, folks, it seems that we have very low attendance. We're almost talking to the converted. I suspect this might be due to the confusion in the original flyer. But maybe I can move now to Ian and get your reactions to Staffan's outlining of the kinds of things that we would expect of a good delimitation, and some of his thoughts about what we are seeing in Zimbabwe. Ian, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Can you kindly confirm that you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thanks, Stefan, for that very detailed presentation. You gave us a good overview of what the international principles and standards for boundary delimitations are. And for us, when you look at Zimbabwe, is I think the people in the meeting will attest to, is that on the legal side, we have very clear provisions regarding what electoral system is in use in the country, regarding the boundary delimitation process itself, because if you go to section 160 and 161 of the Constitution, it clearly speaks to many of the principles that you outlined. The biggest red flag, though, that we have in the country or in the current dispensation or in the context of boundary delimitation in Zimbabwe is that there seems to be an apparent oversight in the Constitution for ensuring that voters, political parties, the candidates, civil society organizations have space to provide oversight over this process. So when you look at the path that this process is going to take, you clearly see that there is no room whatsoever for any concerned citizen, any concerned political party to use a legal basis to challenge the limited access to the process. So this becomes problematic because, like you rightly pointed out, it's been a while since we last had our boundary delimitation. Our constitution gives us a very clear interval. It tells us that once every 10 years, we must have it. By no fault of the ZEC itself, I believe we have unfortunately lapsed beyond the 10 years. We have actually run into 14 years since the last boundary delimitation exercise that was done, and it was done ahead of the 2008 general elections. Now, over time, there's been huge demographic movements of voters within the different constituencies. So the principle of equality of voting strength has clearly been eroded very, very significantly. If you look at the current comparisons of existing voter populations, you'll see that we have constituencies that have variances of upwards of 260-something% variations from the standard set or the average that was anticipated that constituencies must have. So the reason why I bring this up is because there is a lot of expectation that the current malapportionment that exists throughout the different constituencies will be addressed. And so when it is addressed, obviously, we are going to see a lot of shifts in boundaries. And as you know, whenever these shifts occur, there's obviously a strong reaction that people will have. Some will be very happy with the new boundaries, but clearly there are a number of people that will have concerns about how the boundaries would have been drawn. So it would have really been beneficial for the ZEC to look beyond the legal provisions for participation by citizens and then proactively allowed for greater access into the process. So yes, you are right. Currently, they're having voter education campaigns throughout the country, but these are just limited to generic information, which is not really that helpful because we are not worried about the principles alone, but we are worried about exactly how the principles are being applied because you see, these principles are more than what, 5, 6. How are they being weighted? What is the kind of weighting that the ZEC is going to use to arrive at a conclusion to say, so this principle is the one that informs these current boundaries more than the other principles. So that very delicate balance needed, different stakeholders to be able to pay close attention to be able to understand, exactly what's happening with the ZEC in determining those things. But unfortunately, the process has not been that transparent. And if you go by past experience and past interactions with the commission tends to be very legalistic. They will tell you what you are asking for is not supported at law. And so you have no legal basis to be asking for access with regards to, how our teams are deployed, who they are meeting, when they are meeting, and that sort of thing. So what has happened is that we have had very limited access to the process. We have been able to participate in stakeholder consultative meetings, and these are happening countrywide in all the 63 districts of the country right now. But you see, that is not the issue. The issue is not the consultation at the outset or during the process. I think that the more important phase that citizens must be given an opportunity to input is the phase when the ZEC begins to draw up maps. Those drafts that you're referring to, that is very critical for people to be able to see the zero drafts or first drafts that the ZEC comes up with, and then be able to input into those products. But unfortunately, when you look at the law, there's nothing, absolutely nothing that speaks to that. So, delimitation cannot be a desktop study. Clearly, the ZEC must consult at the different stages, at the beginning, during, and towards the end of the delimitation exercise. But if you allow me just within a minute or two to go through the path that this process will take according to the existing law in section 160 and 161 of the Constitution, you'll notice that ZEC is given the authority to delimit constituencies and wards. Fair enough. It then moves on to say the ZEC will prepare a preliminary report. And when it does so, it sends it straight to the country's president. So when the president receives it, the next step is that the president will have to give it to parliament for them to consider the contents of that preliminary report, and that has to be done within 7 days. So these 7 days, that means the 7 days needs to be split between the lower house, the National Assembly, as well as the Senate. So both houses will have to go through the findings or the draft report and then raise any issues that they may have. And then they send it back to the president, who then sends it to back to ZEC for them to look at the different things that parliament has raised. So you can imagine that ZEC, when the report comes back to them with comments from the president and the parliament, ZEC must consider them. That's what the constitution says. But one wonders what that means, because if you are told you must consider, it's not necessarily saying that you must then take on board the concerns that are raised. So it's very clear in that section of the constitution that the ZEC has the final say. So your legislators can raise whatever range of issues, the president can raise whatever range of issues, but none of them have like veto in terms of what the final outcome or the final state of the report looks like. So on paper, that's what is clearly defined, and that's problematic, because at the end of the day, even if the ZEC tells you it's our decision, if they had undue influence, you have no way of then ascertaining. Because at the end of the day, the law says they reserve the final decision as to what the maps will look like and what the descriptions of the maps will look like. And then once they are done with considering any objections or any issues that are raised by the president or parliament, they send the report back to the president. And that at that point is a final report. And when the president gets it, he has to publish it within 14 days from the date that he officially received it from the ZEC. So that's in broad strokes the path that this process is going to take. And if you can look at it, you see that there's no way where provision of oversight of the process by interested parties has been factored in. And so we anticipate this is the path that the process will continue to take. So yes, the commission will tell you we are consulting, we have teams on the ground, but the thing is they are under no obligations to then take on and seriously consider what would be submitted. And clearly there are no public hearings that will be scheduled when the draft products, when the draft maps come out. At that point, it's really an affair between the ZEC, the president, and the National Assembly and the Senate. So when all things are equal, if we had a parliament which had comparable numbers in terms of the opposition and the governing party in parliament, then we could realistically expect a robust debate in parliament on the draft maps or the proposed maps. But if you look at the nature and composition of our parliament, clearly the governing party has an overwhelming majority. So they really don't have a political incentive to listen to objections that may come from the other aisle, political aisle. So what that means is essentially if you're giving something to parliament, you are really giving it to one party because it doesn't need the opposition in order to move things, to move motions, to pass bills and that sort of thing. So this is the red flag that we have, that when you look, when you then put on the one side, the lack of legal provisions that allow for oversight from stakeholders, and then on the other, you look at a parliament which is predominantly filled by one political party, then you have a very difficult context to work with. And so my fear is that the final maps are going to be very contentious. Whichever way that the ZEC draws them, I believe that they're going to be contentious, partly because of the lack of clarity as to the formula that the ZEC would have used as to exactly how the different principles that inform boundary delimitation would have contributed to the drawing up of those maps. So that will be the biggest thing. And this is obviously going to then, unfortunately, erode the public confidence on that process, which obviously has a significant bearing on the outcome of an election. So for me, this is the picture that I would paint regarding the local context of how the delimitation has been going on. To say the law is clear, whilst it's clear, it has its own deficiencies, which is what I just mentioned. The major deficiency is the lack of provision for people to input into the process, really, especially the critical juncture when the maps are put together. And then the other deficiency is the part that the process takes, which excludes stakeholders. We cannot have a situation whereby stakeholders are consulted at the discretion of the commission, because then the commission can decide to what extent it consults, to what extent it doesn't. And clearly it will be difficult to fold them at law. So that is the challenges that I see with the ongoing process. In terms of the ZEC being able to complete the process ahead of the 6-month window, which they are given by the Constitution, you can clearly see by the constant changing of timelines by the ZEC regarding certain bits of the process that has been happening over the last 2-3 months. You get a sense that they also want to get the process completed before December. And so I don't think we will have a challenge of the final delimitation report being issued or being published ahead of that 6-month window. I think it will happen, because ZEC initially said in December they will have the final report, and then quite recently they changed the timeline and said no, in November, in mid-November we will be done. So you see that everything is being sped up. And so that's an indication that they have made a determination to make sure that this process produces a report which can be used for the purposes of the general elections in 2023 rather. But like I'm saying, the major flag is the lack of consultation will breed or will cause many people to be anxious with the process and with the product that comes through. So these are my immediate reactions to your presentation, Stefan. And Tony, we had agreed with Solomon that I would restrict my my reactions to the boundary delimitation side of things, and then Solomon can come in with the voter registration bit, if that's okay with you.
That's perfectly fine. Ian, thank you very much. My initial reaction is looking at the checklist that Staffan provided of the Kenyan thing. It doesn't seem that we would have ticked many of those boxes all the way down. And I take your point about strict legalism, as opposed to one of the comments I think that both ZESN and ERC have made over the year, is the regulatory framework of ZESN of ZEC does allow them much greater flexibility if they wished. So with that in mind, I want to come back with a few questions to all of you in a moment or two, but maybe I can pass over to Solomon, and welcome, and let's have your points about an equally contentious and related issue. Solomon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, Ian and Stefan. I'm going to address the issue of the voters' roll, again, looking at reality grounded in Zimbabwe, and then probably a bit of what other jurisdictions would provide for. But basically, everything comes back to the local regulatory framework, which is the legal framework for elections in Zimbabwe. Also taking into account a few of those international principles that have also been captured very well into the current constitution, and then also with alignments and the other reforms that would actually be coming on board, getting on board the international best practice and regional practices, because these, according to the laws of Zimbabwe, they need to be considered if also Zimbabwe is part to those conventions, if Zimbabwe is part to those treaties. So when we look at the voters' roll, this is a public document maintained by the Electoral Commission. This mandate is very clear in terms of the legalistic approach, if we take the legalistic approach that the Commission wants to take. So then the voters' roll, again, is a key document in an election, should be made public for the purposes of accountability and also for the purposes of transparency. These principles also have been addressed around delimitation by the two other presenters that were before me. Transparency and accountability are also key. And the voters' roll is a document that has all the details about the person that is going to cast a ballot, it needs also to be provided to the stakeholders. And I think the spirit of the Constitution, the spirit of the Electoral Act is very clear in terms of ensuring that there is accountability at each and every level of the election, including as it relates to access to the voters' roll. As we would know, the Electoral Act provides that those that want access to the voters' roll must actually be provided with the voters' roll after paying a nominal fee. There is a nominal fee that is actually provided at law, and within a reasonable time again, of which the reasonability of the time is part of the things that are subject to abuse. When we are looking at a commission also that wants to take a legalistic approach, it means they need to simply comply with that constitution if they take a legalistic approach. But when they look at the practicalities of getting that particular voters' roll, that becomes a problem. And I think in the last 2 months or so, we have had a sense that they want to close out access to this particular document. We've seen one of the commissioners actually posting that they are considering making sure that there's no one else who can access that document, and in the format that it cannot actually be audited, or no one can start the document per se with the details. Part of the reasoning as well that we got in the last few days is that part of the information that is contained in the voters' roll is more personal and would expose citizens. But when you look at the last, I think in the last 2 weeks, there was a whole 562-page document that was released by the Electoral Commission with details, the first name, the surname, the ID, the gender, date of birth, address, polling station, ward. All these details were actually in the public domain. So you wonder, why would they not give out the voters' roll for just public scrutiny for people to see? We have seen them undertaking the process of displaying the voters' roll at the polling stations where by-elections will actually be taking place. This is a good thing. We commend them for doing that. It's actually part of the best practices that we want to see more in our elections. It was introduced around 2019, and we want to see more of this. But this is not sufficient, because if you want to scrutinize a voters' roll, you can't go and scrutinize a voters' roll that has been pasted outside. It just defies logic. If you want someone to be able to make a comment and say, this is what we are seeing in this particular voters' roll, that is not possible. So that is important in terms of transparency at the polling station level, but there are also other actors that are interested in other things within the voters' roll, which is not necessarily the abuse. Of course, we know that there are other people that will use it for other purposes, and that is also covered in terms of the laws. Those that ought to abuse the voters' roll must actually be punished, because the laws provides for that particular provision. So tightening access to the voters' roll has been the major problem that we are actually seeing now. The last time that we had access, it was the voters' roll that was actually released to different political parties. And when we looked at that particular voters' roll, it showed a number of movements of citizens. It showed a number of movements within wards and so on and so on. But because this document was not provided officially, this document was not released by the Electoral Commission officially, then it made it difficult for people to publicly speak about it. Of course, others took the decision to just let everything out and then address the issues. So number one, the issues that we would want probably to see more is the issues around transparency in terms of access to the voters' roll, accountability to the citizens, because organizations do not represent themselves. They represent a certain constituents which they work with, and access to the voters' roll is one of the key issues that also raises confidence in the electoral process, or removes the confidence in the electoral process. So because there are trust issues in the elections, there are confidence issues in the election, there are credibility and integrity issues that have been raised in the yellow, amber to red. The commission needs to move in the direction of ensuring that all these other issues are actually addressed, and then we would not have probably some of the contests that we have around our elections, because people would have confidence that the voters' roll, we had it, we saw it, whatever the outcome of this election is a true reflection of what we saw. There are polling stations that where others claimed that they were more people who came to cast a ballot than those that were actually registered for those polling stations. So all these things can only be confirmed. All these things you can only restore confidence when you actually speak authoritatively on a document that you have access to, unlike where you are actually going with hearsay. So it's actually problematic when we see more of that from the commission, and as we go to the election, we need to look at as well the involvement of other players in the management of the voters roll. Who else is involved? Are political parties also being consulted if there are any changes that are happening? Of course, we see the gazettes, we see all these other things. But in terms of restoring confidence, if confidence has been eroded in the Electoral Commission, it simply means that they also need to be talking to political parties. They also need to be talking to the churches. They also need to be talking to civic society organizations. They also need to talk to almost everyone. And this is a difficulty that we actually find ourselves in. The implications are that we will continuously have issues being raised around the integrity of the outcome of the election. Once there was one voter who misses their name and they don't have an explanation as to why their name is not there, or where people have been moved unknowingly without being informed, because the constitution says ZEC can do that, but they need to inform the people that they have been moved. So around that time, we went into Mbizo around January and so on and so. There were people that were checked in the voters roll that had actually moved from Ward 9 to Ward 8. Some have moved from Ward 8 to Ward 9. So these people, they know their polling stations. They know where they voted. They know their councillor. But when they check their names, they find that they've been moved into certain areas unknowingly. And this becomes part of the problem now, where people will lose confidence in the outcome of the election because they don't know if they've been a target, if they are known to be supporting certain political parties or political leadership. So that becomes a challenge that we see. So trust and confidence in the electoral process can only be restored when the critical documents that are involved in the election are also documents that people have no trust issues with. So it could be about the ballot paper design, printing, and distribution. If people have issues with that, it will still come back when the outcome of the election is actually being announced. And when you look at other countries, they have no major issues around the voters roll. But Zimbabwe also is a peculiar situation. We don't know where it came from, but there are so many other things that relates to the voters roll. We thought by adopting the biometric voter registration system, we will remove a number of these trust issues that we had as a country. But we realized that instead of untangling itself, the commission is continuously binding itself, all sides, closing all the spaces, closing all the avenues. And then I think I can relate sometime in May, the spokesperson said they are considering just shutting it out and then making sure that they are the ones with access. And then whoever wants to access, they can only access their entries. So that becomes a problem when you are a public institution, you are running the election on behalf of Zimbabweans, you are not running the election on your own behalf or on behalf of the commission, but on behalf of every other Zimbabwean. And if they have concerns, those concerns must be legitimately be heard, just like the ones during the delimitation of boundaries, the public consultations that Ian alluded to. Those are important. If you ask us, we have requested for the voters roll for more than 5 times. And then there are different excuses, there are different reasons for each, for them to fail to provide the voters roll. So you look at all these things and think, okay, where then do we go? Are we moving in the direction where we will include everyone, or are we excluding certain people? Are we insulating the electoral commission? Are we insulating the electorate? Are we insulating the vote itself, or we are exposing the vote to abuse? So these are some of the issues that we can relate to. I think I will hand over back to you, Tony.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you, Zoltan. That was very edifying and rather worrying. Well, maybe I can go back to Staffan now to get some reactions to what you've been listening to. You raised the internationally accepted framework. You gave a very good example of the Kenyan process on delimitation. And you raised a number of concerns that you had about the Zimbabwean process. I know you're not been current on it, but you do have some experience in Zimbabwe. So maybe you'll get some reactions to what you're hearing.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, it's super interesting and also worrying to hear what our colleagues are telling us about the situation. And I'm not surprised to hear how SEC is sort of using the law and saying we can only do what the law tells us to do, and these things we don't go beyond that or anything like that. That's not for our mandate, and that's how we operate, because that's sort of the default that almost all, I would say, all EMPs across the world. We had a visit from another election commission here in DC a couple of days ago, and when we had some of the more sensitive discussions as well when it comes to the results process there, the default was to defer to the laws. You know, that's understandable, you know, but you can be sort of minimalistic in it, or you can sort of take that as saying that's the max we can do, or saying that no, the intention here is that we should be inclusive and we should be transparent, and therefore we will not just give the document to the president, we will not just give it to the parliament, you know, we will make it widely available because there's no one preventing us from doing that. So then we can do something different. But I agree with what was said earlier that, you know, only having 7 days for comments is extremely difficult, even for parties that's sort of ready to do it. But and almost impossible if the parties would say, okay, we want to go back to our constituencies and share this document and discuss with them and get their input and get sort of a bit of a ground proofing of it. That's almost impossible with that kind of a timeline. So I agree that the legal framework is far from ideal when it comes to that sort of part of the delimitation process. You know, from you should be clearly giving the obligation of the commission to be much more transparent, that they have to go back to the people affected by the delimitation and not just going to the political elites in Harare. You know, yes, that's one of your audiences, but certainly not the only one. You know, so there's a problem there for sure. So I'll stop there.
Following question, Stefan. You made very strong points generally, but also about Kenya, about the needed expertise to do a decent delimitation. So clearly, one of the questions you would want to ask an election management body, in the interest of transparency, is who did what and what data did you use? That's a critical audit question, would you say?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So maybe I can push that question to Solomon and Ian. Either of you can pick this up. I mean, to what extent do you understand what expertise exists within ZEC? I mean, you pointed out the legal process. They will do the process in-house. And in-house, having done it, they will then send it to the president and they'll follow this legal route. Do you have any sense of the expertise within ZEC that is capable of doing this delimitation? Yeah.
All right, thanks, Tony. Let me start off by making a correction. So, Stefan, I'm sorry I said the parliament needs to go through the report in 7 days. They actually need to do it in 14 days. So it's the president that needs to have looked at the report within 7 days and then send it to parliament, which then spends an additional 14 days before that report goes back to ZEC. So sorry about that. But in terms of expertise, Tony, I think what we can say with the authority is the law permits the commission to be able to receive assistance from any government department that it needs to receive assistance from. So typically when you look at our general elections, you always have the ZEC then taking on additional staff that will serve on a short-term basis, so as to support the increase in logistical demands and other demands that it may have in the period leading up to a general election or to any major electoral undertaking. So it goes without saying that they have received, and they've publicly stated so, that they have been working very closely with Zimstats, which is the official government body that was in charge of the census, and various other government departments to support the drawing up of the maps and the delimitation exercise overall. So in terms of access to the relevant expertise, that is beyond question. That we know they have that at their disposal, because the government is ever ready to send through whatever stuff needs that the SEC requires. But I think the more important point to be made is when that happens, to what extent is the ZEC in charge, fully in charge of the staff that then seconded from other government departments to them? If you ask the commission, they will clearly tell you that we remain in charge because we are the ones that are the appointing authority, or rather the ones that are providing the supervision of that secondary staff. But then I think for all practical intents and purposes, we know that when you have a temporary staff coming through, you will have to retrain them. You have to reorient them. You have to give different set of instructions to the ones that they used to working with on a daily basis. So that becomes slightly problematic, and it's a natural course of things. And so it would not be, what's the word? It would not be strange, it would not be unlikely that there obviously is friction that happens with the staff that comes on a temporary basis, because they would not behave or conduct themselves exactly in the manner that the permanent staff from the commission does. So that goes without saying. So that's my long and winded response to saying, does the ZEC have the capacity? I think they have access to the capacity when they need it. But we also need to be fair to the commission, because at the end of the day, we are judging them, we are prejudging them on a process that they've never done before. So it would be good to also wait and see how the process goes, and also be able to then look at the quality of product that will come out of this process, the boundary delimitation process, and be able to then definitively comment on how well the process was undertaken and how well the product itself conforms to international and local best practice, and also then hear the reactions for the people that are concerned. Are they overwhelmingly happy with the product? Are the political parties happy across the political divide? What do the constituencies or communities where the boundaries have shifted, what have they got to say about the product? So that would also be key in order for us to conclude on this process.
I mean, you've made the point that they have access to expertise. I think it's somewhat different to say who and how, and all of that stuff is a whole different aspect of transparency. Quick comments here, Solomon, and then I want to try and wind up. Stefan's going to leave in a few minutes, so I'd like to give him some last remarks before he disappears. Solomon.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tony. I think if I can address just the issues, Ian also spoke about the process that would happen in different communities, including some consultations, voter education. But I would also want to just draw you to the violence that has been taking place in different constituencies and wards where there are by-elections, and these would speak volumes in terms of, do these communities have information around the code of conduct? Do these communities and political players have information as one of the pillars that we are using to gauge these discussions? Then what does that violence do to inclusion? Does that not exclude? Is the act of violence including other people into the process, or it is trying to exclude them from the process, so that we have a process that is not well insulated, a process that is exposed to manipulation, because there are certain people that have been moved away from their areas. There are people that have been violated and they don't need to actually stay in those communities because they feel that they are not safe. So it's one of the things that we are actually seeing. And when it comes to voter registration, participation in the delimitation consultations, voter education, and so on, that becomes a challenge again. And when this violence happened, so it happened a week or so ago, and then in the next 2 weeks or so, the Electoral Commission is getting into the same community to undertake voter education for delimitation and for voter registration. Would the people come out and vote? Would they believe the integrity of the Electoral Commission that is not speaking to them around the violence? So these are some of the things that I thought I should just quickly react to, apart from what my colleagues have said. It doesn't create a conducive environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. I mean, they speak to 2 points that Jonathan Moyer made in his 2018 analysis. He talked about anticipatory rigging and constructive rigging. And anticipatory rigging, in his view, was the use of violence, bribery, treating, etc., all those sorts of factors. And then the constructive rigging, I suppose, is really what we're trying to look at, is the ways in which the systems may be corrupt or inappropriate or ineffective. Stefan, I know you've got to disappear. We very much like your last remarks listening to this, and deep thanks.
No, thank you so much for the invite. And I think it's been fascinating. And you know, since you recorded, hopefully people will go and listen to it in later on and so on. So it's not, yeah. So it will be beneficial for a lot of people. And I'm confident they will be coming so once they listen to the discussion. Just 2 things, Ian. I agree with you. You know, we should give SEC a bit of the benefit of the doubt, but I tend to follow the saying that trust but verify. You know, that's sort of something that I'll tend to have with me in my back pocket when I'm working with election commissioners around the world when they promise me that they're going to do improvements. So I say I trust you, but I will come back and verify that it's done as you said. You know, that's simply how I function, operate. And also that was mentioned by Solomon. I think it would be very interesting to make an effort to go back to the local communities once the new boundaries are drawn and educate them on it and see the reaction from them. You know, maybe that's one of the, I know the train has left the station and so on and so forth, but maybe that's one way of putting some pressure for reforms moving forward when it comes to the timelines and the process by which that sort of first reading and second reading of the new delimitations being dealt with currently in the legal framework. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. And now when I reconnected, I will make my best to stay slightly better on top of what's happening in Zimbabwe as we're getting closer to the 2023 election. So thank you very much.
Stefan, thank you very much. We will, in fact, this is recorded. It will be posted on YouTube so people can listen to it. We will transcribe it. With your permission, we will use your PowerPoint to produce a policy brief outlining all of these points and make this widely available. And hopefully, maybe in one of the later sessions, or when we perhaps right at the end, we'll bring you back and we'll see where we've got to, and you can get a feeling of whether we've done it well or not.
That'd be fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all. Thank you, my friends. Bye-bye.
Okay. At this point, quickly, is there anyone from the floor who wants to raise anything? If you do, please put your hand up in the chat. I'm sorry it's so small. We obviously had a mess with the flyer going out, the first flyer. People, I think, thought it was going to be later than it is. But if there are no comments, any last comment to make from you, Ian?
Yes, Tony, I was having trouble with my mic. I think we have considered a number of things during this call, and my takeaway and my parting shot is the ZEC has to maximize on the remaining time between now and the time that the final product is out to try to reach out to the different categories of voters different political parties and candidates so that they are fully briefed on the process. Number one, and number two, that to the extent possible that they also share the draft products that of the delimitation process, because that would be very key. It's really not very useful, and it's a lost opportunity for us to have a situation whereby when the draft report, when the final report is out, we then have contested elections, we then have strong objections to the final output. And there was an opportunity to consult before finalizing the draft, and also then adding or contributing towards the strengthening of integrity of our electoral processes. It will be a missed opportunity. Whether it's explicitly provided for at law or not is perhaps neither here nor there, because people have a right to administrative justice, they have a right to participate in public affairs, and all that allows for the ZEC to then offer these opportunities for people to weigh in on these processes. And it doesn't in any way restrict the ZEC, in my opinion, from consulting at the beginning and in the middle of the process, and not towards the end of the process. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ian. Thank you. Solomon, any last thoughts?
Okay, thank you, Tony. I think from Stephan's presentation, I think I did note that the inclusion in the Kenyan process, I think it's one of the key takeaways. The group that has been included in that process is actually key and important, because it brings in the key competencies and the key components that are actually needed to make sure that the delimitation of boundaries works better, and you have fewer chances of doing backs and forth. Because if you see that they include the water authority, because there are rivers involved, they include the road authorities, because there are roads that are actually going to be involved, they include historians, sociologists, and so on and so on. These are also important in the sense that the process becomes more inclusive, and then they are in a position to provide more information from their angles of specialization. And that's very important, because elections are a specialty. It's expert driven. You might want to do an election, but if you do not know how to interpret certain pieces, then that becomes difficult. But you would need other sets of information that comes from elsewhere. You need business associations to be able to talk to you, because some of your boundaries might actually be moving those businesses away from certain areas. And then you create quite a number of conflicts from that process. And you then need other commissions, constitutional commissions, to come on board and ensure that they support you and they insulate you against any other attack or these integrity, credibility issues that might actually emanate post the delimitation of boundaries. I think those are my submissions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you very much. Well, my takeaway is that when we consider the issue of inclusion, and we raised two issues around inclusion. One was delimitation, which we've given a considerable amount of attention, much less to the voters' role, and we may need to come back to that. These two critical issues about inclusion seem to me, by best practice outlined by Stephan and then amplified by you folk, inclusion is in deep trouble. We're stuck with, as both of you have pointed out, a strictly legalistic interpretation of how you go about these things, what Stephan called a minimalist position as opposed to a maximalist position. And I think both ZESN and ERC over the years have pointed out again and again to ZEC that it's completely within their mandate to be much more transparent and accountable. And those adhering to those two principles would create that kind of trust and confidence in the Electoral Commission. And yeah, it's worthwhile pointing out, that the Afrobarometer does these surveys of various people across the country, if it's government offices. Zimbabweans consistently give ZEC a very low rating. The majority of people say they do not trust ZEC. And I think this evening's discussion, pointing out what would be the kinds of things that ZEC could do that would create trust and confidence, are what's missing. So we need to mull on these things. As I said, we will post this discussion on SAP's YouTube. We will get the transcription, so the transcription will be there for those who like to read and not listen, and we will produce a policy brief based on the discussions here. So I've said thank you to Staffan. I want to say thank you very much to both you, Ian and Solomon, for agreeing to be here. Zessen and ERC are very important partners in this discussion going forward. We will be looking again at elections in a couple of weeks' time. We're not certain yet which of the pillars we'll look at, but I think that, Solomon, you did suggest that the growing trend towards violence suggests we should be beginning to look at insulation and people's ability to be able to participate in all the activities around elections. So from SAP's Trust, my colleague Ibo Mandaza, who unfortunately can't be here, he's at a conference in Dakar, and from myself from the Research and Advocacy Unit, and from David Mpofu, who's been looking after the back end.
Avoti tango ekomaka kaina komi moto ona